Shabbos, what we discussed on Erev Shabbos was whether or not the goyrel is mandatory, and the Gemara at the end said Al Mahagrol Ma'akva Tiyufta, right? Tiyufta Manamar Hagrol Ma'akva. So we proved that the goyrel is Ma'akiv, placing the lot. That means lifting it up to identify which animal is Lashem, which animal is Lasazel. Placing the lot back on top of the animal is a mitzvah, but it's not Ma'akiv. And then we also had a machlokes that Reb Shimon, the Tana, held that the goyrel is not ma'akiv, because Reb Shimon said that if one of the animals got lost, you just replace it and you don't have to make a new goyrel. And then we learned that the vidui is also a machlokes if it's ma'akiv. Reb Shimon held that the vidui on the sir lazazel is ma'akiv, and the Tanakama held that it was not ma'akiv. That's a basic chazara of a little bit of a complicated Gemara that we learned on Erev Shabbos Mem. And now we'll start Mem Aleph. Before we begin, I just want to announce that tonight's broadcast and today's broadcast is sponsored by Rab Benzi Bench, and it's Le'ilu Nishmas, Benzi's grandmother, his mother's father, Pinchas, ben Rab Zev Klein, Olav Shalom, whose yahrzeit is Yud Beis Nisan, which is today, and the Neshama should have an Aliyah.
Yud Beis Sivan, not Nitzim.
I'm sorry, yeah, Yud Beis Sivan. I'm a little famished. That's right, Yud Beis Sivan. And Mazel Tov is the first on the bris that's going to be tomorrow, Mitzvah. There's a bris tomorrow with an einikel. I'm hoping to be able to surprise Moti.
The Shabbos was the naming of another einikel, your einikel.
Wow, Mazel Tov, beautiful. The Nacha should pile up more and more and more.
Amen.
Beautiful. Okay, so let's
see. What are you doing? What are you doing in Lakewood?
What am I doing here?
What are you doing there? Like why?
You mean why I came?
Yeah, like you were just there like a few weeks ago.
My mechutin is making a wedding tomorrow night.
Ah, very nice.
So we came in for that wedding, and we're going to be going back Monday after share. Okay, Gavaltik.
Where are you, in Lakewood?
I'm in Lakewood, yeah. And once again, I want to thank ID Tech, which is a computer information technology company that always lets me use their boardroom whenever I want. And I'm very appreciative to them. So this way I can say shir without my eniklach making noise in the background. Okay, so let's see the Helig Gemara. We're up to Omar Chista, which is the fourth line on Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. Omar Chista. Ein hakinin mispar shois el oiva lekichas bailam oiba asiyas koy. There's many times when one must bring a pair of birds. A woman who's a yoledes, if she can't afford a big carbon, a rich man's carbon, she brings two birds, one's a chatos, one's an oila. By the oila v'yored, the carbon of dalus, which means there's three levels of carbonos depending on where you hit with the tuition committee. You go to the tuition committee, and they tell you what you can afford. Either you have to bring an animal, or if you're not wealthy, you're middle class, then you bring two birds. And if you're below middle class, then you just bring a carbon mincha, and the tuition committee decides what you bring. And we're going to be focused on the birds. When you bring birds, you bring a pair of birds. One bird's a chatas, one's an oila. So the question is, you buy two birds. At what point can you identify which bird will be the bird that's going to be the chatas, and which bird will be that the bird's an oila? So you can't just do it any time. There's only two occasions when you could establish which bird is going to be a chatas and which bird is going to be an oila. And when is that point in time? When the bailam first purchases the bird, if at the time of the purchase he says, I'm buying this for a chatas, this for a oila, then that's the way it is. If he doesn't, then it's no longer in his control which of these two birds will be a chatas and which of these two birds will be an oila. Rather, oiba asiyas kohen. The next opportunity to determine which bird is which is going to be determined by the kohen. When you give him the pair, he'll decide which one he wants to make the malika on for the chatas, and which one he wants to make the malika on for the oil. So again, the bailam only has one opportunity, right when they buy it. If they don't identify it at that time, then it's left to the kohen. Omar Absimi Barashi, my time with Reb Chista. Where did Reb Chista get this halacha from? The ksiv, it says, referring to the Ledis and Pashtus Riyah, the Lakha Shtei Sarim or Shnei B'nei Yoina, So Velokha means at the time it says Echad Lechatos, Vechad Laila, Echad Laila, Vechad Lechatos. It says. So you see at the Lekicha, at the purchase, is when you could determine which bird is which. Then later on, the pasuk says that the kohen the kohen makes it a chata. So you see, the kohen also has that ability to determine which is the chatas and which is the oila. So that's the makar. Zok the Gemara Meisvei. Once Rabbi Chisda said his halacha, and he said where he got it from. Now we could try to rip him apart. Meisvei Zok the Gemara. V'aso chatas. It says by us in our sugya of Yom Kippur that you take the goyrel that says Lashem and you put it on the animal and it makes the animal into a chatas. And we learn that a goyrel oisa chatas, vein Hashem oisa chatas. What determines that this animal should become a chatas? The fact that the goyrel clarified that this was the chatas. Vein Hashem oisa chatas. You can't just on your own just say, I want this to be the chatas. It's not up to you, it's the goyrel. Sheyochel, because you might have thought, in fact, that you could, without the goyrel, determine which is the oila, which is the lashem, and which is the lasata. Because valadinu, umaba mokaim, shaloi kiddush goyrel. Madach, when you're determining the two birds, which is the oila, which is the chatas, there is no goyrel mechanism available at all. The only way you can determine which bird is the oila, which is the chatas, is kiddush Hashem, is because you declared it. So mokam shekiddush hagoyrel, by the two seir Yom Kippur, where you even have the additional mechanism of goyrel that you don't normally have anywhere else. Surely einodin sheyikadas Hashem. Surely you should also be able to determine which is the seir Hashem and which is the seir Lazazel by identifying it yourself, by declaring which is which. That's what I would think. Talmud Loimer, the pasuk by Yom Kippur says very clearly, "Vaso chatos," that hagoyrel oisa chatos, ve'ein Hashem oisa chatos. The only way you could determine which is the Hashem and which is the Lazazel is with the goyrel and not with any other type of identification. Frak the Gemara, we know there's a rule we just learned that the only time you can determine which carbon is which, and the Tosfos Yishom speaks out, although we learn it from birds, that is applied to every time a pair of carbonas is brought. The only time that you could determine which is either the shas lekicha or the shas shchita. But the hacha by the goyrel, the lav shas lekicha, the goyrel is not when you first purchase the animals, it's once you have them already. The lav shas asiya, and you're not shechting the animals either. It's in between. It's lav shas lekicha, lav shas asiya, vikatani, and we learned the kava that the goyrel will be kaveya. So this is a direct steer to Reb Chisda. Reb Chisda said there's only two times where any set of karbanis can be identified, yet clearly the Torah tells us that there's another place through a goyrel that's in between the lakicha and the asiya. Amarava hachika amar. This is what the Brisa meant. Ma b'mokim shalei kiddush hagoyrel. Madich, by a carbon where there's no mechanism of goyrel. Va'afilu b'shas lekicha. Va'afilu b'shas asiya. You couldn't even make a goyrel when you bought them, nor could you make a goyrel for the kohen right before he's about to shechter. The goyrel mechanism has no shaykhus. It's not at all available when you're picking which bird is which. Nevertheless, kiddush Hashem. When you declare it, which is an oila and which is a chatas, it does work. B'shas lekicha u b'shas asiya, limited to those two time periods. Mokum shekiddush hagoyrel she's lo b'shas lekicha v'shaloi b'shas asiya. Yom Kippur, where you have a goyrel that the Torah tells us that the goyrel works, and the Torah tells us that the goyrel works not b'shas lekicha, not b'shas asiya, rather sometime in the middle. Ein oidin sheikadas Hashem b'shas lekicha b'shas asiya. So at least they should also be able to identify it b'shas lekicha b'shas asiya. So that's the Brisa. The Brisa never has a havamina that you can identify which is which anytime. But the Brisa wants to argue that maybe when they buy the two seirim, the Gizbar should be able to identify at that point which is the Lashem, which is the Lasosel, or later on when the Kohen is ready to shech them, he should be able to determine which is the Lashem, which is the Lasosel, right. just like by the birds that you could determine. Talmud Leimer Vaso Chatos, the pasuk declares that by Yom Kippur, there's only one way to identify which is the Oila and which is the Lazazel, and that is which is the Chatos, which is the Lazazel, Hagoyel Oisa Chatos, Vein Hashem Oisa Chatos. The only possible way to identify which is through the Baal. So Reb Chisda just dodged the first missile. Excuse me. Tashma. We'll try another one. Metame Mikdash Ani. So Metame Mikdash is someone who came into the base of Mikdash when he was Tameh. Rashi says, Nanichnas Mikdash Tameh. It was a shogeg. What is the carbon that he brings? V'hu carbon oil of He brings a carbon oil of yared. Like we discussed earlier, there's the ashiras, which you would bring a behema for a chatas. There's dalas, which would bring two birds, one an oil, one a chatas. So again, to be clear, if the person needs to bring an oil of yared is rich, he brings one behema only. It's going to be a chatas. If he's not wealthy and he has to bring birds, then he has to bring two birds. One's a chatas and one's an oila. And then there's dalei dalas, which is a carbon mincha. Hamur etel shvus bitoi, shvus kol Allah. The oil of yared applies to several different avers. One of them is swearing a false shvua, and it also applies to someone who came into the Beis Hamikdash where he's tummy. So the halacha is, again, he has to be assessed how wealthy he is, and based on that assessment, it's determined what type of carbon he brings. Now, what happens if he did the avera one day and he doesn't bring the carbon until 3 or 4 months later? At what point do we check his financial status? Does it matter what his financial status is when he did the avera, or does it matter what his financial status is when he's bringing the carbon? So the halacha is his financial status that's important is his financial status when he's bringing the carbon, not when he did the avera. What triggers what type of carbon he has to bring is the time, his financial value at the time that he's bringing the carbon. So let's see what it says over here. It says as follows.
Do you mean that if he was an usher when he did the avera, and he's an ani now when he's bringing the carbon, that he has to bring the carbon of an usher?
No, if he was an usher when he did avera, and he's an ani when he's bringing the carbon, so we look at his value when he's bringing the carbon, and he would bring the carbon of an ani.
Okay, so go for cat. If he was an ani when he did the
avera, and then he hit it rich, then he has to bring the carbon of the usher. And that's exactly what we're going to be discussing. Someone whose situation changed. So Toshma, Mitame Mikdash Ani, when he went into the base of Mikdash and he was Tameh, he was a poor person, which means he was only going to bring 2 birds. The Hifrish Shema is Lakina, and he set aside money to bring his birds. And he bought a 649 in the meantime, and he won. The Hesher, he became wealthy. After he became wealthy, Bi'achach Omar, he went to the money and he said, this money will be for my carbon chatos, and this money will be for my oil. So what is the halacha? The problem is he doesn't have to bring a bird chatos anymore. A bird chatos is no good. So the Braj says, let's say he had $20 and he said $10 are for my chatos and $10 are for my oil. So the $10 is for his chatos. Now he can't bring a bird. Now he has to bring a chatos behema. Now, behema might cost $100, so he can use the $10 that he set aside for the chatos bird. He can add $90 to it, and then he can buy a behema because that's what he has to bring. But the ein moisef who may be chayvasem mit meilose, the oila he can't use towards his chatos. So what we do with the oila we'll deal with later. But whatever the case is, he's going to use the same money he designated as a chatos. He'll just add to it and buy a behema with it.
Yossi, I didn't know, the Beis Hamikdash had a poverty line? What did I?
You want to know what the target value?
Tuition committee.
Oh my goodness!
You want to know how it was determined?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Equifax. They use the Equifax.
If you pay full tuition, you get a behemoth. If you're on subsidy, you bring.
It's the other way around.
If you pay nothing,
you
bring a
say
minimum.
that.
No, Yossi, I think
Yes.
that it brought you came, it was public. Oh, he's bringing a rich behemoth. He must have money. So the tuition committee looked at what kind of behemoth you were bringing.
I mean, it wasn't the tuition committee determined the behemoth. The tuition
No,
was judged
Fakir,
based on the
it can't be like that.
Maybe-
Because
maybe
then
they're looking
everybody
at-
would just bring a mincha.
Maybe they were listening at what kind of Avera that you did.
So I always used to say that I paint a completely different story when I speak to the tuition committee that I paint when I speak to Shatchana. And the worst thing that can happen to me if a member of the tuition committee calls me to read me a shidduch, because then I don't know where to put myself. And I remember a couple of years ago, I had a daughter in Shidduchim, and it was Hanukkah time. And everybody that I knew that had anything was in Florida for Hanukkah. But I couldn't afford to go to Florida for Hanukkah, but I couldn't afford to be caught in Toronto because then I'll never do a shidduch with my daughter. So what I closed my blinds and I closed my lights and I told my kids we can't leave the house. And I put a message on my answering machine that I'm sorry that we're not able to get your call. We're at our Florida complex. And when we get back on Tuesday, after the long weekend, I'll get back to you. So we didn't answer any phone calls, and there's a whole weekend the phone's ringing. Tuesday morning, I pick up my messages, and who is it? Hello, Yossi, this is the tuition committee calling. So Shine, my mazel. So at the end of the day, I don't know how they did the Beis HaMikdash, but they probably had some way of making the assessment.
What does it mean that he only brings an oila? What does that mean?
No one only brings an oila. Either if he's bringing an animal, he only brings a chatas.
So how is it he's exempt from an oila? What does that mean?
Because he only has a chiyuv to bring a chatas. But if you bring birds, the Torah says you have to bring two birds, one for a chatas and one for an oila.
What's the logic? What is it?
This is all exeris hakosov. I don't know the reason why. So if you're wealthy, you bring a behemoth. If you're poor, you bring two birds, one a chatas, one an oila. And if you're very poor, you bring only a mincha. So I don't know why by a bird you have to bring an oila as well.
What's the purpose of an oila? Is to show fealty to Hashem?
I guess you want to soften up the defenses with an oila, and then you bring your chatas in. Okay,
but if you're rich, you don't have to bring an oila at all.
If you're rich, you just bring the chatas. That's right. You see, if you're rich, you get the rich get richer. You only have to bring one carbon. Okay, so let's see what it says over here. So this fellow, when he did the avera, he was an ani, and then he separated money for his birds, and he became wealthy. So now, and after he became wealthy, he said, "This is the chatas, this is the oila," which is already a mistake because he shouldn't have been bringing an oila at that point. But whatever case, he did that. Now the question is, what do you do with the money? So the chatas money, you just add to it and you buy a behemoth with it. The oila money, I guess you can bring as an oila sudava, but you cannot use the money that you designated for the oila towards your chatas. That you cannot do. Sfek the Gemara. What was the story? When did this guy designate which money was for the oila and which one was for the chatas? After he set aside the money, and way before he actually was shechting anything. So at this point, the lav shas lakicha, he's not at the time of setting aside the money where he first designated the money to a carbon. The lav shas asi, and according to Reb Chisda, those are the only two times where you can designate. Nevertheless, v'katani the kava. This brisa says that if he designated some money as the chatas and some money as the oila, it sticks, and that's why he can only use the money designated for the chatas, but he cannot use the money that was designated for the oila. So you see, his designation sticks. According to Reb Chisda, why would his designation stick? It wasn't at one of the two times where a designation has the option to stick. Reb Sheshes, you're asking me a question from this brisa? I'll prove to you this brisa is a mistake. This brisa, anyway, is inaccurate and requires some renovations. Because we have another problem here. The Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Hoshia. Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Hoshia that Metama Mikdash Osher, if someone did the Avera while he was an Osher, and the heavy carbon ani, and he brings the carbon of an ani, lo yotza, he wouldn't be yotza at all. So Oibazoi, the kivin de lo yotza hechikava. What happened over here? He was Metama Mikdash ani. Then he was Mafish Moit, and he became rich. Once he becomes rich, he can no longer say Eilu lechatasi, veilu loylasi. Because once he's rich, all he's allowed to do is bring a chatas. So if that's the case, how does this work? Besides your problem, how does it work? Because it's not at the right time. How does it work? Because he's not an ani anymore. So if he's not an ani, he can't even designate Eilu lechatasi, veilu loylasi. So clearly, this brisa is not to be understood at face value. Elamai, what do you have to say? What you're going to have to say is, V'chivin de la yotza hechi kava. Elamai is lachamemar, shekfar omer meni yusay. What are you going to have to say? That this is what happened. Matama mikdashani and v'hivrish mas lakinai. V'hisher, and not v'achakach omer elu l'chatasi ve'elalasi. Rather, you'll have to say is before he became rich, when he was still eligible to bring one as a chatos bird and one as an oila bird, before he became wealthy, he designated which money would be for the chatos and would be for the oila. So once you're already placing this achakach, that it really happened before he became rich, so say that when did he designate Eilul Chatasi, Veilul Alasi? When he first designated the money. So the way you'd understand this Bryson now is he did the Aveira of walking into the Beis Mikdash when he was Tomei. When he did, he was poor. And right away he took money, he took $20, and he said, these $10 are for my oila bird, and these $10 are for my chatas bird. That sticks. That sticks because it's at the time of the Lakicha, and it sticks because he's an ani. So he's making the proper designations. Afterwards, he became rich. Now he has to bring a bigger animal with a lot more money. So the halacha is that the money that he designated for the chatos, he'll add to it. And rather than buy a bird, he'll buy a behemah. And the money that he designated for an oila is an oilas nadav. So that's what the Gemara answers.
Let's say when he set aside the money, he just said, I'm setting aside the money to bring my carbon. He didn't specify whether it was, do we by default know he had to bring the oila?
Well, he had to, if at the time where he set aside the money, he was poor, right?
Right.
And he set aside money, so one would be for a chatas, one would be for an oila. But nothing, but there's no specific money designated to either one. So you ask me, what if he didn't designate any money at all? He just took $20 and he said, this will be for my karbonis, and he was poor. And then he became wealthy. Can he use all of that money towards his chatos? The answer is yes. Because there was never specific money that was designated as an oila. There was just general money that was designated towards his carbon chiyuv.
But his chiyuv was at that time for an oila and a chatas.
But since he didn't give any money specifically, he didn't have an oila, it's general enough that he can now apply it fully to a chatas. There's only a problem if he designated money specifically for an oila. Only then can he not repurpose it towards his chatas. But if he didn't designate it for an oila, he left it general. It's much from the brisa here that you would be able to put it towards the chatas. So Zok the Gemara, this is a very good assessment of the brisa. You're proving to me anyway. I have to say the brisa is out of order, and once you prove that it's out of order, it resolves the problem that we had with Rav Chisda, because everything happened at the time where he put aside the money. But Frank the Gemara, Ulu Rab Chaba Omar B'Yoshia, Dama Yotza, Rab Chaga, in the name of Rabbi Yoshia, said that an usher who brings the carbon of an ani is Yotza. If an usher brings the carbon of an ani is Yotza, now there's no reason to change around the meaning of the brisa. Because yes, even though he became rich, he's still able to say Elul l'chatasi ve'elul l'lasai. Because an usher, if he brings the carbon of an ani, it will be good. So now it's back shver and the b'chista, because we're not going to make the brisa into a mistake. We're going to say it's accurate. And if that's the case, it proves against Reb Chisda that you can designate which is a chatas and which is an oila, not at the lekicha and not at the asiyah. So we're tzarik shver on Reb Chisda. And that's up to Gemara. Michael Mimmer, what are you going to say according to Reb Chaga? So Gemara, loy tema va'achkach amar. Don't say va'achkach amar. Elaima va'achkach lokach. So say what happened is he became wealthy, and then he didn't designate which money is a chatas and which one is an oila, because he can't. He has already put aside the money. But what he did now is he went now to buy birds. If he bought birds, even if Chisda would agree that that's a new opportunity. Even though Chisda said there's only two opportunities, when you first set it aside and buy the asiyah, but if you had money and now you're purchasing birds with it, that creates a third opportunity to designate which is your chatas and which is your oila. So therefore you'll say after he became wealthy, he took the cash and he went to buy birds. Since he went to buy birds, he's now able to designate which is a chatas and which is an oila. So loy tema v'achach omar, ela ema v'achach lokach. v'omar. He bought new birds, and when he bought the birds, he said, which is a chatas or which is an oila. Fact,
But when he
that
bought
makes
the
no
words, he
sense
was
at all.
wealthy.
I'm sorry?
If he was wealthy when he bought the words, he was doing the wrong thing.
That's correct. But Reb Chaga holds that even an usher who wrongly brought birds will still be yotzei the carbon. We're following now Reb Chaga. The first number we were following holds it wouldn't work. But now we're going based on Reb Chaga's way of thinking that it would work. So he became wealthy and he could still go out and buy two birds and it'll stick. One will be a chatas, one will be another. Perfect. Now it makes no sense. Because what did the Brisa say? You take the chatas money, you add money to it, and you buy a behemoth. But he already has a bird already. Lokach, he bought the bird already? Well, then moisif umevi chayvasai? How could he add money? It's a bird, it's not cash. Mine, what are you going to say? The parak lay. You're going to say that he redeems the bird, takes the cash back, and then adds cash to that to buy a behemoth? But ain't pigeon life. You could never ever redeem a bird. Once a bird gets Kedusha's carbon, you can't redeem it. So you can't learn that the Brisa is speaking where he went and bought birds. Because once he went and bought birds, the rest of the Brisa makes no sense. That he can add to the money of the chatas and buy an animal, because once he has a bird, he's stuck with it.
Why can't he sell to somebody else and used to bring a chatas?
You can't do that. Once he designated his bird, it's his. I'm sorry?
It's Kaddish. The guy's going to bring it for a chatas.
I guess once it's designated as his bird for his carbon, he can't even sell it to somebody else. Because and your kasha proves it. Because if he could just sell it to somebody else, then the Gemara wouldn't have this problem. So it must mean that he can't sell it to anybody else either. So Amar Papa. So how are you going to understand this price? He took the money, of which part of it was going to be an oila, and part of it was going to be a chatos. But he didn't buy two birds. He only bought one bird. So if he said, I'm buying an oila bird, well then moisif umevi chayvasim et mechatosei. So he had $20. With $10 he bought a bird. There's $10 cash remaining. So if he bought an oila with $10, the $10 cash that was remaining that he didn't buy the bird chatos, he can add to that and buy a behemoth. The high oila azul nidava, and the oila will be brought as an oilus nidava. And he chatos oven, if the one bird that he bought was a chatos, then ein moisif umevi chatos chayvasim et me'alosei. Then he's stuck, because the bird that's a chatos he can't do anything with. The money that was supposed to be an oila, he cannot add to it and buy a chatos with it, because that cash has already been designated as an oila. By the fact that he bought with some of the cash a bird for a chatos, by default he's designating the remaining money as the oila. And that money remaining as an oila cannot be used to buy an animal that's a chatos. And v'hachatos azul misa, and the bird that he designated as a chatos, you can't do anything with it, and you let it die. So that takes care of Reb Chisda. Gufa. Now we're going to go drill down to this shaila of whether an usher could bring the carbon of an ani or not. So we've been talking about the carbon oil of yored, and by the carbon oil of yored, which is brought for the aveira of going into the Beis Hamikdash when you're tamei, it's brought for shvuos bitoi and some other aveiras. This carbon, we have a machlokes if an usher could bring the carbon of an ani. Amar Belazar B'Hoshia, Mitama Mikdash Usher Behevi Carbonani Lo Yotza. He's not Yotza. So you have a machlokes if an usher will be Yotza with a bird and not an animal. Meisvei, the Gemara is going to ask a kasha to prove that you're not Yotza. It says Mitzayra Ani. A Mitzayra also has the three levels of carbon. So a Mitzayra also, if he's poor, he brings birds, and if he's rich, he brings a behemoth. So Mitzayra Ani Shevi Carbon Usher. If a Mitzayra Ani that brought a carbon Usher, so he upgraded, Yotza he'll be Yotza. But an Usher Shevi Carbon Ani, but if he's rich and he brought a carbon Ani, Lo Yotza, he's not Yotza. So this is a kasha on Reb Chaga, because Reb Chaga said that if someone who is bringing a carbon oil of a yored and he's rich and he brings the carbon of an ani, he's yotze. Yet this brisa says if you're rich and you bring the carbon of an ani, you're not yotze. Zok Gemara, there's a difference between mitzayra and carbon oil of a yored. Reb Chaga only said that a carbon oil of a yored, if an usher brought the carbon of an ani, he's yotze. Mitzayra is different. Shiny yosem dechsiv zois. It says zois tia Torah Samatzayra. This precisely has to be done. Follow my rules exactly. If you're rich, you may not bring and you will not be yotze with the carbon of a poor person. If the Torah says you got to stick to the rules, well, the Torah has rules about poor people also. And the Torah says a poor person has to bring birds. You can't give more tuition. You're not allowed to pay more tuition if you're poor, because the Torah specifies, Zois, bring this carbon of birds. Don't bring the carbon of animals. So tomorrow for that, Harabi Rachman Torah says those Torahs. I'm a Torah. So Torah is Marba. So it's a Zoistia Torah Samatzara. So now it's a little bit strange because we have one pasuk that seems to indicate that you have to stick to your prescribed carbon. You have another pasuk that indicates you don't have to stick to your prescribed carbon. So we're saying if you're rich, you have to stick to your prescribed carbon. If you're poor, you don't have to. In fact, the Gemara Vatanya Toras L'Rabbis Mitzayra Ani Shekevi Karbonosher would be good. So Vatanya is b'nichus. So Vatanya, we learned in the Brisa that Toras is L'Rabbis Mitzayra Ani Shevi Karbonosher, that he will be Yotze. Yochel Afilu Asher Shevi Carbon Ani. If you have a reboot from Torah to say that you're allowed to bring something other than what's prescribed for you, and then Ani is allowed to bring the carbon of an usher, so why don't you flip it around as well? Say an usher also could be Yotze with the carbon that was not prescribed for him, let him bring a carbon only. So we have Zois and we have Torahs. Zois tells you must stick to your carbon, and we apply that to an usher, cannot downgrade. And Torahs, we apply to an ani and we let him upgrade. So by Mitzayra, we have psukim to say that an usher may not downgrade and an ani may upgrade. Yet by Oila V'Yoyrit, Rav Chaga is saying that an usher is allowed to downgrade. So v'neilef we know. Why don't we learn carbon Oila V'Yoyrit from Mitzayra? And just like by Mitzayra, we say an usher cannot downgrade. So too by carbon Oila V'Yoyrit, the usher should not be able to downgrade. So tomorrow, meet Rachmana vim dalhu. The Torah says vim dalhu, and Rashi says it's a miyat. Mitzayra, who the usher shevi carbon ani la yatsa. Davka by Mitzayra, who davka by Mitzayra will an usher not be yotze with the carbon of an ani? But other types of carbonas that are varied based on your income doesn't have that restriction. And therefore, Rav Chagai holds that by a carbon oil of a yored, if you're rich and you brought the carbon of an ani, you will still be yotze the carbon. Okay, now we're up to the next step. After they did the goyel, now we have a sir l'Hashem, we have a sir l'Azazel. How do we process them? Zok the Gemara, kashar loshen shal zahuris b'ray sir ha'mishaleach. They took a red clump of wool, and they tied it on the head of the Seir HaMishtalech. And remember, we said that that's going to turn white as it goes down the mountain. Where did they place the animal? They placed it, Rashi says, near the door that the kohen, or that the person who's going to take this animal to the peak, which door he's going to leave from the Azara, and that's where they left it. They left the animal there with the wool on its head. Ulenishchat, and the animal that's going to be shechted, the Sir Hashem, connected beish shchitasei. They leave it connected beish shchitasei. The Gemara is going to clear momentarily what this means. Does this mean they put wool, just like they put wool on the Sir HaMishtalech? They'll put wool by the beish shchita, by the animal's neck? Is that what it means? Or does it mean you don't put wool at all on the Lashem? It just means you put the animal near the place where it was going to be shechted. And the Gemara is going to resolve that shaila later on. Baloi etel paroi shniya. After the seirim were set up in their position, the Sir HaMishalech in its position, the Sir Lashem in its position, then he went back to his par to say vidui once again. V'som yishtayod of alav u'misfada. V'kacha yo'omer on Hashem chatose avisi u'bashati lafnecha ani uvesi uvnei Aaron am kedoshecha on Hashem kaprina la'avoynos v'lapshoyim v'lachatoyim shavisi v'shabashati v'shachatasi lafnecha ani uvesi uvnei Aaron am kedoshecha takoso v'saris moish avdecha ki b'yom hazeh yichaper alechem l'tar eschem mikol chatoisechem lafnei Hashem titaru. he said the Shem Hashem 3 times in this statement, in this vidui, and Klal Yisrael answers, Ve'noi nachar Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusai La'olam Vad. Frag the Gemara, Iboyelahu. It's quite clear that you put the red wool on the head of the Shir Mishtalech, and then you take the Shir Mishtalech and you let it wait at the gate to the Azara that it's going to be leaving on its journey. But what about the Chai? Iboyelahu, Ulanishchat Akshirakai. When it says Nishchat Connected Beishchitasai, did the Tana mean you put red wool by the neck of the animal? Or it means you don't put any wool on it at all. You just place the animal near the place that it's going to be shafted. The Tani Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef said, Kashar Lashon Shal Zahuris B'Roy Sira Mishtalech. They tied red wool around the head of the Sira Mishtalech. V'hamidoi Keneged Beis Shiluchai. And they placed it where it's going to leave the Azara to go to be sent to the peak, the mountain peak. Ulenishchat, and the Sir Lashem Keneged Beis Shchitasai. But here Rabbi Yosef adds some extra explanation. Why do you do this? Shelo Yis'ar Zebazeh, so the Sir Mishtaleach should not get mixed up with the Sir Lashem, and V'lo Yis'ar V'achem, and the Sir Lashem as well as the Sir Lazazel should not get confused with any other Seirim that might have been hanging around in the Azara. Zok Gemara. If the Sir Lashem also had wool wrapped around its neck, Shapir, it makes perfect sense because you're not going to confuse the 2 animals because there are wools in different places. The wool on the Sir Mishlech is by its head, the wool on the Sir Lashem is by its neck, and neither of these 2 animals will be able to be mixed up with any other animals because no other animals have wool around them. But if you're going to learn that when it says V'la Nishchat, you don't put any wool around its neck, you just place it near the area where it's going to be shechted, I know it won't get mixed up with the Sir Mishtaleach, the high Carter Bay, by Law Carter Bay, because the Sir Mishtaleach has wool on it, and the Sir Lashem does not, but Ba'achrini Mias Mi'arif. The Sir Lashem, which has no signal sign on it, no label on it, that could still get mixed up with another Sir. So you see what the Mishnah means is that they actually tied red wool around the neck of the Sir Lashem. And this way, we knew it was the Sir Lashem and it wouldn't be mixed up with any other animals. Amar Rabbi Yitzchok said, Shtei Lashoinei Shemati. I heard in the Torah, there's 2 times where you need this lashon, this tongue, which is like a roll of wool that's in the shape of a tongue. I heard about 2 times in the Torah where this type of wool clump is required. Achas al par, once required for the processing of the par aduma, because it says you have to take wool and throw it into the shreif of the par. You're supposed to throw it into the fire that's burning the par aduma. The achas al sir mishtaleach, and the other wool is what we've discussed in our sugya of the sir mishtaleach. Achas trichashir. I also found out that one of them has a specific amount, a minimum amount that needs to be used. And the other one, any amount is going to be good. But but I don't know which of these 2 require some type of minimum shear and which one doesn't. So Amar Rabbi Yosef, let's think about it, let's analyze it, and let's see. We know that the wool that you used for the Sir Mishalech, you tore it in half. And only half of it did you put on the head of the sheep. The other half was put on the mountain on top. So the Kohen, even if he didn't want to lean over the edge, or it wasn't necessarily the Kohen, whoever pushed the animal over the edge, even though he didn't want to lean over the edge and look down to see if he can catch a glimpse of the wool to see if it turned white, he'll have a sampling of the wool right up here on the stone up on top that he could see. So if you have to tear it in half, then boy yishir, clearly you need some minimal amount because you need enough that you could tear it in half. But v'shal para, all you're doing is you're throwing it into the fire. The loiboya chaluka, you don't need to separate it into 2 pieces. Loiboy yishir, any tiny amount of wool would suffice. Matzkav l'Rami bar Chava. The paranami boy koibet. We know that the wool of the paraduma has to be thrown into the fire. If you take a tiny little piece of wool and you try throwing it, it's just going to float away in the air. So you need enough critical mass that it'll have enough weight that when you throw it into the fire, it'll actually fall into the fire. So, why do you say that it doesn't need a shear? It also needs a shear. So your logic in determining which one needs a shear is faulty. Amarava, Rava said, this thing, this halacha that you're quoting, that the paraduma, the wool that you use with it, has to be heavy, is not unanimous. It's a machlokes. It's a machlokes. So therefore, your kasha, Rabbi Bacham, is not shver if Rabbi Yosef holds that the wool of the paraduma doesn't have to be heavy. You mentioned that the par, you used a clump, you throw it into the fire, you don't have to separate any wool like you have to do with Allah Zoza. How do you process the wool that you're going to throw into the fire, the paraduma? Karchan b'shiyarei lashon. You throw into the fire the leftover of the lashon. Now, if there's a leftover of wool, that means you must have had a larger piece of wool of which you separated a piece of. So once again, you see you need chalukah. So it doesn't mean you separate wool. It means you take the wool and you stretch it so it becomes thin. So that's what it means. You tie the bundles of grass with wool that you stretch thin, but you never separate it into two pieces. So therefore, you can't argue that you need to separate the wool of the pardum into two pieces. So we still have Rabbi Yosef's shita that since the sir lazaza, that wool has to be separated into two pieces, that would require some minimum shear. But the wool that you throw into the fire of the paraduma, that does not need to have any minimum shear. Amar Chanan Amarav, eitz erez ushni toilas. It says that you take eitz erez and you take toilas, so you wrap it around, and you have to throw that together as a bundle into the fire where the paraduma is burning. So what happens if shekol tosan shal heves? The way Rashi learns is that it never fell into the fire, but you threw it into the fire and it went through the flame. It got on fire, but it never fell into the fire. Zok the Gemara kshera. It's kosher. Meisvei freik the Gemara. Nishavev haloshoin, if the loshon of wool that you were going to be using for the paraduma got singed, maybe lashon acher, you have to bring another one. In other words, this is no good. Maybe lashon acher mekadosh, you have to bring another one. So how could you say that shalkonton shalavis is kshera if the brisa seems to say that it's not going to be kosher? If it's a flame that's a big flame that's shooting up high, and you throw it through that flame, that's not, even though it got burnt, that's not called that it was ever sitting in the flame, because it was airborne through the flame. But if you just have a small little fire on the floor and it went through that flame, that's considered in the flame because it's right over the flame. That's what Rashi learns. Tosfos Rishonim learns this completely different, and he learns that the shaila was but it fell into the flame. First it got singed, and then it actually fell into the flame. And the problem is, maybe the fact that it got singed before it fell into the flame, maybe that disqualifies it. And that the Gemara asks, this have a lotion, maybe lotion nachem mekadosh, and then a bayater lakacher kam b'keileches kam b'nechfefes. By keileches, if it's in a big fire and it got singed and the fire shoots up high, that would be considered good. The opposite of Rashi. That means it was in the fire, and since it was in the fire, it's going to be kosher. Kam b'nechfefes. But if it was a small moving fire, then the fact that it got singed, since it wasn't considered inside that fire, it wouldn't be kosher anymore. So there's two different pshatim in this Gemara. Zok Gemara, Rav Aimer, Koivet Tanoi. Rav says you don't have a kasha b'chlal about whether or not if it fell into the fire, if it's kosher, and you're asking me a kasha that it's possible, because it's telling the machlokes tanoim. It's telling the machlokes tanoim whether or not it even has to fall into the fire. The Tanya, Lama Karchan. Why do you tie up the azov, the grass, with the threads, the shnitolas? It's kedei sheichulun biaguda achas. Divrei Rebbe. not because it needs any type of weight. We want it to be one unified bundle. That's why it's tied together. So there should be more weight to the bundle. So you see, in fact, there's a machlokes if this wool needs to have weight to it so that it should fall into the fire, or even if it's very light, it doesn't matter as long as it's all together, and therefore it doesn't need to fall into the fire. I heard shalosh l'shana shamati. You just mentioned earlier that there's two places where we need wool. I heard there's actually 3 places where you need wool. Achash al para, like we discussed. The achash al sher mishalech, like we discussed. The achash al mitzayra. But the mitzayra also requires wool in his process. Rashi brings down t'chsiv beinami u'shnei las ve'ezoid, which was also used in the process of the taharas hamitzayra. So zok to Gemara, achas mishkal asarzus. Out of these 3 wools that are required, one needs a lot. It needs 10 zuz, the weight of 10 zuz of wool. The achas mishkal shnei sloim. One is only 2 sloim, which I believe is going to be 8 zuz. The achas mishkal shekel, and one's only going to be 2 zuz. But the eni lefarish. But I don't know which of these 3 shiurim line up to which of these 3 needs. Kiyasa Rabin. When Rabin came, Pirshim Mishmei Rabbi Yonasan, he, in the name of Rabbi Yonasan, explained to us which shear applies to which subject, and he said as follows: Shel para, from the para duma mishkol asarazus. You need the heaviest one. Why? Because it has to have weight, so that it will fall into the fire. V'shel seir mishtaleach mishkol shnei sloyim. You need a middle level because you need to be able to tear it in half. V'shel mitzayra, which has no shear at all, mishkal shekel. It would be enough with a shekel. I think we should stop here, and we'll pick up tomorrow. So shkoyach everybody. Once again, the broadcast was sponsored by Benzi Bench, Lidl Nishbus, his mother's father. I'm going to just mention his name again. I have to just pull it out. Whose yahrzeit is tonight. His name is Rav Pinchas ben Reb Zev Klein, Olav Shalom, and the Jewish is Yud Beit Sivan. Everyone should help that we should all have big schusim. Let's see what great brachas are in today's daf. There's goyrolas here. Listen, we should all win our goyrolas. That's what it is. Whatever we run into, whatever our goyrol in life is, we should be manoim goyrolenu. My yofer Yosy Simon. We should only have bracha. Yeah, get the vach.